Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Kelly and I are really excited to share more about shared gifting. So this is Ellie Lanphier talking. I'm the Program Associate in Philanthropic Services, and I'm joined here by Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly Buell, and I'm the Director of Philanthropic Services here at RSF, and we're really excited to talk with you all today.
We want to share a little bit more about the history of shared gifting, the intention behind it, and the process, the nuts and bolts of how it works, what we do and what we've learned. But we also have some questions for you all. So we've saved the last 20 minutes for questions and conversations. And we encourage you along the way to type in any questions that come up for you, and go ahead and type those into the chat box. We'll respond as they come in, or we might save them until the end of the presentation portion. So you should see a control panel with a chat box on your screen. If not, look for that small red arrow, and if you click on that, the control panel should expand. And if you're having any problems with your computer audio, please feel free to call in using the phone number and access code provided in the email. So Kelly and I have structured this today in the format of an interview. So I'll be asking her some questions that I've prepared. And again, feel free to go ahead and add your own, and I can add those in along the way, but I'll kick us off. So Kelly, hi. Tell me a little more about shared gifting. Give us an overview of sort of the concept.
Sure. So as you can see there on your screen, shared gifting is a collaborative granting method that gives ownership, distribution, and allocation authority for gift money to the participants of the shared gifting circle. So basically the key concept here is that we're inviting nonprofit organizations, grantees, to together collaboratively decide how grants are allocated amongst the group based on the community wisdom. And we see nonprofits as holding the knowledge of what's needed on the ground, and so they're in a really great place to make decisions about how grants should be divided.
Where did the shared gifting concept come from?
Yeah, so the shared gifting concept actually came from a woman in Wisconsin. Her name was Elise Casper, and she was a philanthropist, and she also studied the work of Rudolf Steiner. And she had come into some money and was really moved by this concept that she did not want to be alone in the decision-making process. So she didn't want, as a donor, to feel like she had to decide in a vacuum how grant money should be distributed into the community. So she started the first group, which is a group of Waldorf schools in the Mid-States region. This group met for the first time, I think, in 1984. And basically, Elise would make a grant to this group. So it was, maybe around $50,000. And then the group would get together, and all those Waldorf schools, and they would decide together how to divide the money up amongst the group. And so they would write proposals, and they would read each other's proposals, and they would share how their schools are doing, and they would spend a weekend together. And in the end, they would come out with, their grant amounts. That group actually has been meeting since 1984. This is a picture of the meeting that we had with them last weekend. So they're still going strong. There's now 17 schools that are participating in that circle.
What inspired you to replicate this model outside of this group?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess in 2009, I had the chance to observe the Mid-States Shared Gifting Circle for the first time and see their process. And I was just really moved. The way that the process works with that group is really creating feelings of abundance instead of scarcity in the grant making process. For me, it was just sort of like a stark comparison to traditional philanthropy, where in my role at RSF in the Philanthropic Services Department, I just saw how traditional philanthropy tends to work, where grantees are applying to foundations, and every foundation has its own sort of mission, and the foundations decide how the grants are made, and sometimes that's not always transparent. So there were sort of, these challenges I saw in the philanthropic field. And so that actually led me to write a white paper called Transforming the Dynamics of Philanthropy. It's available on our website. And I talk about the first, shared gifting circle that we did outside of the Mid-States group, but also really did a bit of research into some of the historical and social history of philanthropy in the U.S., how it started, and kind of some of the core assumptions that are built into how it works today. And from that, I saw just sort of some challenges in the field of philanthropy. For example, there's this very basic assumption in philanthropy that the donor is in control of the funds, and the donor decides how those funds, should best be distributed. And so some of, the negative outcomes of that I saw were that nonprofits are often trying to make their programs fit into, what the foundation says their mission area. So there's some nonprofits can have mission drift instead of the nonprofit saying what their needs are, they're kind of fitting their programs into what the different strategies of the foundations are. Something else I read was, a common challenge in the field of philanthropy was that grantees are often in competition with each other, especially if there's, limited funders, limited foundations in a certain focus area, then all those nonprofits are really competing for funding. So grantees are really taught to compete rather than to collaborate. And then also just in the whole, submitting a grant proposal, and then whether you get the grant or not, there's not always a lot of transparency or feedback that's provided to nonprofits around their grant proposals. So I've seen definitely in the field of philanthropy a lot of foundations working to change some of these things, which is great. But yeah, those were just some of my key takeaways. And I think especially what I've seen lately in the field of philanthropy is like this focus on outcomes tracking. And a lot of nonprofits have to spend time and money to figure out how to track outcomes to sort of like prove that they're doing what they said they were going to do. A lot of foundations call grants investments, which is a really interesting concept. You think about it, they call the outcomes as like the social return on investments, which is just a really interesting kind of way to think about grants. And so basically the thesis of my white paper is that in the philanthropic world, grants look and feel more like purchase transactions, that they're almost more like contracts for work provided by a nonprofit. And they don't really feel like gifts, because I think that gifts are really about trust, right? And like not having any strings attached, and gifts really build community, and they allow nonprofits to, take risks and experiment and innovate. And I think that's what nonprofits really need when they're dealing with, the complex issues in the world today. So basically, I was really moved by this model because I thought it really brought the feeling of gift back into grants. So that's a long answer to your question.
That's great. Thank you. So let's get into the nuts and bolts. How does it work?
Sure. Yeah. So there's actually sort of two ways to do it that we've seen. The first I'll talk about is the Mid-States group. So they kind of have developed a method over the past 25 plus years that they've been doing it. And the way that they do it is they each put up on a chalkboard, because it's usually at a Waldorf school, and they put up how much they're asking for. And then in the first sort of round, we'll call it, everybody self-reduces. So if you asked for 5,000 and everyone asked for 5,000, there's 17 groups and there's only, $20,000, that's never going to work. So they basically self-reduce until the total adds up to how much grant funds are available. In this last weekend, we had a couple of schools reduce themselves down to zero, which was a really moving, they basically said, your work is so important, I'm going to take my proposal off the table. So that's the first round. And then in the second round, you can actually see it on your screen right now. This was the second round. So it starts with the totals at the top, where everyone had their kind of self-reduced grant amount, and then from that they each grant more money back, or they grant their own money back and forth to each other. And so it's really a beautiful process. This probably went on for over an hour. And so the way that they do it is they say something like the Chicago Waldorf School would like to grant $200 to the Da Vinci Waldorf School because the project you're doing with your school garden is so important and we want to learn from what you learn. We want to honor that. So it's really weaving this web of community and solidarity through all these sort of like micro transactions. And as you can see on the left, the very left of the screen, the Alabama Waldorf School is one of the schools that self-reduced to zero, and they ended up at the end getting about $1,000 to take home with them despite their best efforts to give it away. It's just a beautiful process. People really acknowledge and see each other and name the different ways they want to collaborate. And yeah, it's beautiful.
And what about outside this group? What does it look like?
Yeah, so the model that we've developed at RSF is slightly different, and the reason that we did that was because we knew when we brought this model outside of the Waldorf School community that we'd be working with a more diverse group of nonprofit organizations that may not have necessarily worked together before. So we knew that there needed to be some community building and then also just some kind of safe space creation in the process. So the way that RSF does it, from the beginning, we're always working to take RSF out of the decision-making process. So that's kind of our key concept is anytime in the process we're trying to turn over the decision-making to the community. So from the beginning, what we do is we look to our RSF borrowers and we see where there's really cool work going on, and we'll go to one of those borrowers' communities. And that's how we select the community that we'll do a shared gifting circle in. The next thing we do is we reach out to everyone we know in that community and we invite them to nominate nonprofits in the focus area that we're working in. The one on your screen, for example, is Skagit County in Washington. This was our circle from 2013. Viva Farms is a borrower of ours up there. They're in sustainable food and ag is the focus area. So these are all nonprofits in the field of sustainable food and agriculture. So everybody that's nominated is invited to submit a proposal. We review those proposals, and in this case, it was wonderful because we got 7 proposals, and we invited all 7 groups to join the circle. Sometimes RSF does have to make a decision at that point to limit the group, and that we have gotten up to 20 proposals, and the largest group we've been able to facilitate is 12 nonprofits. So when we do have to make those decisions, we don't really do it based on like who has a stronger proposal. We're really looking at the diversity of organizations in the pool of proposals. So we want to make sure if it's sustainable food and ag, for example, that there's maybe like a city farm and maybe an educational group and a farm workers' rights group. So we want to make sure that all the voices are kind of present at the table. So that's sort of our decision-making framework for when we do have to decide who to invite. So then when the meeting happens, it's a full-day meeting, and we spend the first part of the day really just sharing personal stories, and then we have participants share more of their organizational biographies, and we do a little artistic activity, which you can see in the picture here, which is fun. And then the second half of the day, we really invite everyone to start to ask questions about each other's proposals. So we share the proposals ahead of time so everyone can read them. And it's a really beautiful moment in the meeting because people can start to ask really direct questions of the people sitting there. What did you mean by this? Or, I wasn't clear who your stakeholders were in this proposal. So it brings a lot of transparency and clarity to the proposal process. This is also a part of the meeting where a lot of collaborations start to emerge, where people are saying like, oh, we asked for the same thing, or we have the same needs, like maybe we could share funding for that. And so that starts to pop up here. And then we get into the shared gifting process. It's slightly different from the Mid-States group. The way that we do it is we take the amount of money available, we divide it by the number of organizations there, And then we have like some portion of that each group gets to keep. So say $1,000. And we do that really because we want the organizations not to be worried that they will go home with nothing. We want to make sure that they know that their time will be, covered financially. And then with the rest of, their share of the money, we ask them to grant that out to the other organizations in the room. And in that process, we've really found that it gives them the chance to sort of be the funder. A lot of nonprofits are always asking for money. They're always interacting with donors. And so this is a chance for nonprofits to get to sort of be in that position. And how are they making decisions? What is it based on? What struck them out of each other's proposals? And then we go around and they share that. And that can be really powerful to hear, what did you like about my proposal? What was confusing about my proposal? What compelled you to donate? It's a really great experience. And then we also have a round 2 with our model, which is basically exactly the same as the Mid-States group, where with your sort of total grant amount that you have, you can then re-grant to the other organizations to, if there was a group that didn't get as much as they needed, people can grant to them if they feel like that work's really important. In the Philadelphia circle, everyone was kind of giving money to one group so that they would come and train everybody else. So there's like a lot of these different types of collaborations that emerge.
So this next slide is of our most recent circle in North Carolina, which was our, I believe, 5th circle outside of the original Waldorf Schools group. So by now, you've had some experience in facilitating this process. So tell me a little bit about what's worked really well, and then also, what have been the challenges?
Sure. Yeah, there's highlights and challenges of every meeting. I think some of the highlights that are just shared in every meeting is this, the potential to collaborate. I think that it's interesting that when you sit a group of 7 to 12 nonprofits down together, they have a lot in common. They have a lot to talk about. They have a lot to share, and they're kind of doing that as soon as the meeting starts. At the breaks and at lunch, they're just sharing information and they're sharing resources with each other, and then that's becomes more formalized in the shared gifting process. But that's kind of just this beautiful thing that always tends to emerge. I think some other highlights that we've seen are that they have different groups have sort of like come up with projects in the moment and like created side pots to fund those projects, which has been really cool to see. And so that's always nice when we feel like groups want to continue to collaborate. We purposefully don't make them multi-year grants because we don't want to force collaboration. But we have seen a lot of the groups, continue to collaborate into the future. So yeah.
What challenges have you seen?
Yeah, the challenges really vary from group to group. I think 2 of the most common challenges that we've seen, one is there is a lot of different relationships and just kind of a lot of things that are going on behind the scenes at nonprofits and in the field that the nonprofits are working in. And that isn't something that's always visible to us at RSF. We do pre-interviews with all the participants to try to give them an overview of the day so they know what to expect. We realize that this can be an anxiety-provoking process. If you're asked to go into a room and talk about money with your peers, that's not a normal thing that we're all prepared to do. So we talk to them ahead of time, but we've definitely had a few meetings where there's kind of these like subtle undercurrents of different power dynamics going on that we weren't completely aware about, that sometimes we'll find out afterwards, like, oh, that's what was going on. Like, we didn't realize that was happening, in this region. So it can be a little bit challenging for RSF to, understand some of the deeper, currents that are going on. I think another thing that comes up as a highlight and a challenge is the diversity of groups. With the Waldorf schools, for example, they're all Waldorf schools. It's apples to apples. When we bring these groups together, it's very diverse. Some groups are like one staff person organizations. Other groups are $1 million budget organizations. They have different goals, they have different strategies, and we've found people say that that's both challenging and it can also be a real, it can also really be a highlight because people get to hear different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, this is what the big organizations do, or this is what, this is what the small organizations do. And I think too, it's a great chance to kind of unpack assumptions, because I think sometimes people come into that room thinking like, why do you need a $5,000 grant? You're huge. And that person can say, I'm like, I have to fundraise for this program. There's no one else fundraising for this program. And so people get to really see and understand things in this really transparent way. And it's really great.
How do you know if a shared gifting circle has been successful?
It's a good question. I think, some of the ways that I would say I identify success. One is that if you see perspectives shift in the meeting, this can be a lot of different things. One is maybe someone learned something about another organization that's a peer of theirs that they never knew, or they were holding on to some like assumption that was wrong. So then they get a chance to shift their perspective. Another is just the perspective shift of being a grantor to your peers. Having that kind of peer-to-peer relationship and accountability is a perspective shift. Feeling like you're in collaboration instead of competition. So I would say seeing some of those like shifts in perspective is a key to success. Another big success is always the unprompted collaborations that happen. Sometimes those happen more than others. I think in Philadelphia, the group has met, I think, like 3 or 4 times since we convened them last fall, and they actually submitted a funding proposal as a group to another funder, and so that's really exciting to see that they found the process so useful that they wanted to continue to work together. Another fun little story is this picture on your screen is a barn dance that was held at Pie Ranch in 2011. This was our first shared gifting circle we did outside of the Mid-States group, and that circle really wanted to have a larger conversation with the community about sustainable food and ag, and then end the day with this really fun barn dance. And so that was something they actually created a side pot to make possible. And I guess the last sort of success indicator I would say is a lot of people will have moments of inner transformation that they'll share with us either that day or afterwards about just how blown away they were by the power shift or just the gratitude that they felt for being recognized by their peers. And I think people can find it to be a really transformative experience. And I think that's an indicator of success.
So what other similar grant-making methods have you seen in your work with shared gifting?
Yeah, so I've actually been collecting others in the field that are doing this work, been reaching out to them and trying to learn more about who else is in sort of the collaborative grant-making field. So I'm going to name a few here that I found, but this is also a chance where I'd love people to sort of jump in and send us information if you know of anyone else. There's a group in Maine called the Maine Network of Community Food Councils, and they actually have been using the shared gifting model that they've seen us using, and so but they've been using it within their member network, and so I've been in contact with them, and I think that they've been really happy with using that as a membership organization. There's another group that has been inspired by our shared gifting model called Indigenous Ways of Knowing and Learning, and that's a group of Indigenous leaders from around the world that have been convened to be like the leaders of a grant-making circle where they decide on grants to other Indigenous organizations. There's a group called Forward Community Investments, or formerly called the Wisconsin Community Fund, that I actually just found out was inspired by the original Mid-States Shared Gifting Group. And I think this was a few years ago, but they used to do a community funding day where they would bring everyone together in the community, and I think they would also create the proposals in the day and then sort of vote on them. So that was a really neat model to hear about. In the investing world, there is one group called Village Capital that brings a bunch of social entrepreneurs together, and they review each other's work, and then they vote on one entrepreneur that will get all of the funding. So that's another model. And then there's a lot of models that would fall under the category of what I would call participatory grant making. It's a little bit different. It's where foundations or grant makers invite members of the community, activists, community leaders to sort of sit on the decision-making board and provide feedback that way. And there's a ton of people doing that work. Funding Exchange is probably the best known example of that. They started, I think, in 1979, and they invited grassroots activists to come and make the decisions about how the funding would flow into the world. Participatory grant making is really great to have community members involved in the decision-making process. It's slightly different than what we're looking at here, which is actually for the group to be the givers and receivers in the same circle. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think what I'd love to invite anyone who's on this call to join us in a learning community about collaborative grant making. I will be sending out an email to anyone who's interested, but please contact me too if you're interested, just to sort of share if you're doing this work, if you're interested in this work, if you want to try this work. I'd love to start like a community of practice where all of us can share what we're learning and what the challenges are.
We had a really good question come in.
Sure.
So I'd like to ask you now. So the donors who have provided gifts to make shared gifting possible.
Yeah.
What are they requiring outcomes? Are they want RSF to track and share some outcomes? What are their goals for supporting?
That's a wonderful question. The donors that we've had have really been inspired by the model, and they've really, I think in honor of the model, have really let the gifts be free gifts. They've given the gifts to RSF to do shared gifting with it, and to do this, you can think of it as sort of research about how this model works and how to make it, continue to work and work better. So yeah, I would say that the donors just want to support the model, and they don't, they don't have a lot of requirements, which is very nice. It's a gift in itself.
It is amazing. So often I get asked this question, and I thought maybe we'd ask it now to address it in case anybody else out there has it. Why is it called shared gifting?
Yeah, we played around with the idea of calling it fund sharing for a while, but we landed on shared gifting for a couple reasons. The gifting really specifically because the word grant has a lot of connotations for better or for worse, and we really wanted to bring this feeling of gift into the name of the process. And then the sharing is this word that for us represents community building, but also not just that we're receivers, but that we're givers too. So it's kind of like reciprocity in that way. So it's this idea of coming together and giving and receiving gifts together. So shared gifting.
Right. Kelly and I had a question to the listeners, which maybe you could kind of type in your answer, and then we'll move on to another question in the meantime. But the question to you is, Kelly and I have focused mostly on identifying groups to do shared gifting circles with through our network of borrowers, just to tap into what's happening in their region, and that's kind of where our knowledge base is at RSF. But we're really open and interested in trying new ways to identify what groups to bring shared gifting to. So if any of you have any ideas of how to identify those groups, please feel free to chat us now or send us an email later, but we'd love to hear from you. So I had another great question come in. I'll read that. Has RSF Social Finance compiled financial data on how the value of the shared gift is amplified through the shared gifting process, such as $50K circle has led to $75K impact?
Oh, wow. No, I mean, like, the fast answer is we haven't done that. That would be a really cool research project to do. So far, we've really just done qualitative sort of analysis of the impact, really just, storytelling. We do a follow-up survey with everyone after a shared gifting circle to sort of collect, what they thought were the highlights and challenges and any other feedback they want to give us. And then we usually sort of check back in 6 months to a year with the group, just to see where they're at. And so everything we collect from that is really just qualitative at this point. So it would be really interesting to figure out how to actually collect the financial data on that. It's a good idea.
Another great question came in. What would you think is the smallest amount of money that would need to be pooled to make this experience, all the effort that it takes to kind of facilitate this circle, worth it?
These are all wonderful questions.
They are.
So a concept that RSF works with is something called right-sized grant making, I think is what it's called. But the idea being that we want to make sure that nonprofits are getting paid for their time. I think a lot of nonprofits are used to sort of, a lot people aren't always, thinking that way, but it takes a lot of time to write a proposal. It takes a lot of money to show up for a full day meeting, and that's time that you're not spending, doing the really important mission work of your nonprofit. So we like to see the grant amount sort of be valuable enough that it's sort of covering that time plus some. So our sort of amount that we looked at is like $6,000 to $7,000 per organization, and so that's kind of the metric that we're using. However, the Mid-States Shared Gifting Group, they work with a much smaller amount of money, and they have been inviting more and more Waldorf schools to be a part of it. So like I said, they're now to 17 Waldorf schools, and they had 40,000 to work with. And I mean, we haven't done a survey yet, but my guess, just from how the meeting went, was that everyone would say that it was completely worth their time because they get so much out of the camaraderie and the sharing of, highlights and challenges, best practices. They were, talking about, there's 5 or so of them wanting to start a capital campaign, and, could they get one person to come and do a webinar for all of them? So there's these kind of ripple effects of benefits. And so I think, depending on the group, even a small amount could be really powerful if the collaborations were so valuable to the groups.
Another great one came in. Are there situations where you think the model would not, or maybe should not be tried, would not work or shouldn't be tried?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I can't think of something specific where it shouldn't be tried, but I do think it's worth mentioning that it can be a really challenging process. Talking about money is hard, and we're really not, as a culture, trained to be able to do it well, necessarily. I think something that John Bloom, our Vice President of Organizational Culture, says often is that you can have nonprofits, you can have nonprofit leaders who are all doing this amazing work in the world, and then when you start to talk about money, a different set of personalities shows up. And we call that our money self. That's what we call it here at RSF. And so I think something to think about if you're going to be doing one of these circles is what are some of the tensions that exist in the community, some of those undercurrents that are a little bit hard to grasp sometimes, like the inequalities and the socio-cultural, racial, gender dynamics that play out. I think it can be really hard to sort of wrestle with all of that in a day.
Right.
So I would love to think that everybody, has the potential to collaborate and to use this model to tap into their community wisdom about decision making. But it might not everyone might get there the first time. It's sort of maybe a practice you have to build too.
Mm-hmm.
So to just be mindful, I guess of that would be my advice.
Mm-hmm. Pay attention to the importance of a lot of prep work.
Yes, right? We do a ton of prep work for all of these meetings. So I actually have something I call my shared gifting kit that I put together, and also feel free to email me if you'd like a copy of that. It has sort of our process outlined, timeline. It has templates for the agenda and the emails and everything else. So yeah, that's available.
Thank you all for these fabulous questions. This is really great to hear your thoughts and your questions. And one just came up I'd like to read. Would you usually just have one person representing each organization at the circle? And if so, who should that be?
Another great question. You guys are awesome. We've done circles where we've had people bring more than one person, and we've also done circles where we've said that you can only bring one person from your organization. The times that we've said you can only bring one person from your organization, it's been because we've been working with 12 nonprofits, and together with RSF, that's a lot of people to facilitate for a day-long meeting with all of the content that we have to get through. So it's really just sort of a practical reason. When we've had smaller groups, we have let people bring someone else from their organization, and that's been wonderful when it's possible. I think in terms of deciding who should come, it's always a really fascinating process to watch, because what will usually happen is everybody wants to know who's going from the other organizations to know who they're supposed to send. So, if there's a lot of, at some point we'll send out sort of a participant email list, and if it's a lot of executive directors, it kind of, everyone starts to send their executive director. We've gotten a lot of development directors before. And I think that for us, the most important thing is that the person who comes be someone who can speak about the proposal, that they can speak to the work, that they understand, what the needs are, what the organization is asking for as their need. And I think the person who comes, it's also really important that they are able to sort of make a certain level of decision making, because sometimes you're asked to cut your proposal down, or you're asked to make a commitment to collaborate, and that's something that it's really helpful if the representative can sort of make those decisions or feels comfortable making those decisions on behalf of the organization. So yeah, I mean, we've had lots of program people come as well. So having a diversity of people is really great, and so it doesn't need to be like the same role for every organization.
Thanks. Here's another one. Are there facilitators you would recommend to lead the process if the funder doesn't feel qualified?
Yeah, I mean, Ellie and I, I think, yeah, I mean, besides these other groups that I named, and I don't completely know how they're facilitated, Ellie and I really facilitated all of the meetings that we've had so far. So I would actually recommend that you would not have the funder facilitate. I think one of the keys to why this has been really successful, but I'm open to check this assumption, is that we don't ever have the funder in the room, and that we hope, or we've heard, creates a place where the grantees can really be honest about their challenges and be really open and transparent and vulnerable with each other. There are some funders maybe where that would work, and we would actually love to experiment with that, having a funder that wanted to be in the circle with the group. But yeah, we've had a lot of, after the process, we've had a lot of grantees say, as much as they hate to say it, they often are putting up a front, for foundations about how their work is going, and this is can be a safe place to talk with their peers about the challenges of the work. So yeah, I mean, I think that a strong facilitation is also a key part of the meeting.
And I would add maybe a little bit about the Mid-States history, which I think is interesting, that Elise actually chose an advisory group to sort of facilitate those funds for her, and not wanting to be that sole decision holder. So that advisory group actually makes the decision of how much of her sort of bequest is available for the schools to use. Just adding sort of one more layer of shared, power holding, and then the schools, originally kind of scratched it out themselves. They, had a number, and then they had to figure it out how they were going to give it out to each other. So also depending on the group that you want to work with, maybe they'd be really energized by just, not having a facilitator.
Yeah, that's a great point. The schools groups self-facilitated. They would pick a chair each year, and so that would actually rotate through the group, which is another great example of shared community decision making.
Right. Okay, another question from our listeners. Can you speak a bit about the composition of shared gifting circles? You've seen that we've worked with groups of schools and groups of farms, but have you explored groups where members have the same mission, but their approach is different? For example, the mission is food access, there are food pantries, cooking programs, health services, etc.
Yeah, I love that idea. And this was sort of the question that Ellie was asking of everyone earlier. So basically, as I mentioned, the Waldorf schools, it's a very apples to apples kind of group. And as we moved into doing it, most of the circles we've done, I think 4 out of 5 have been in the realm of sustainable food and agriculture. And we've really just worked with like the very diverse groups, as you mentioned, and that's sort of like the path we've taken to work with diverse groups. But there's definitely another path to take that we would like to take about thinking about this idea of having groups where their mission is, more similar, or maybe they're part of a membership organization, or maybe they're already collaborating. And so that's sort of a question that we're holding for the future, is how to find those sort of groups that are already working together and bring that model to them, where there's those pockets of people. We think that this method would be especially successful in those groups, just from what we've seen from the Waldorf Schools group. So yeah, I think I hope I answered the question, but yes, we want to do that. We think it'll work well, and we'd love to hear your ideas about it. So
we've had a few requests for contact information, so I'll advance to this next slide so that we can have that up there, and we'd love to hear from you after the call, but feel free to continue to send your questions in. And Kelly, I just want to ask you, what's next for Share Gifting?
Yeah, so for 2016, we have 2 shared gifting circles planned. One, we're really, really excited to be working with the foundation in Dallas, and they're going to be working with us to do this model with their grantees. So this is the first time that we'll be using the shared gifting model sort of with a foundation and with their community. So we're really excited to learn from that experience and to work together with that foundation. And then we plan to do another, it'll be our 6th shared gifting circle in the area of sustainable food and agriculture in the fall. And we're not sure, but we're thinking that it'll be back here in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Great. Well, that's all the questions that I had for you, Kelly. Anything you wanted to add we didn't get to?
No, nothing I could think of.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all again for your amazing contributions, and we'll have some follow-up items headed your way, after this call, and we're happy to be in dialogue further in any way that you would like to engage. So please reach out. Thanks so much for your time today.
Yes, thank you.